It weighed 248,500 pounds. That's the Caterpillar D11, the largest bulldozer the company has ever built, rolling off a factory floor in East Peoria, Illinois, on its way to tear into a mountain somewhere else in the world. But the machines were never really the story. The factory that built them is the story, and so is what that factory did to the men who worked inside it. For more than a century, one company in the heart of Illinois has built the machines that moved America's mountains, dammed its rivers, tore open its mines, and cleared its battlefields. It built the dozers that pushed roads up volcanic ash while Marines were still dying on the beach below them. It built the diesel engines that powered Sherman tanks across Europe, and the tractors that hauled artillery for an army that had run out of horses. Caterpillar didn't just sell equipment, it armed an industrial empire. So here's the question that's going to follow you through this entire story. How does a company that built the machines, that built modern America, end up known inside its own walls for burying its own workers, 3 of them in less than 3 years, in the same building? And how does that same company, after nearly a century in one Illinois city, simply pack up its headquarters and drive away? This is the story of the factory that built the machines that crush roads through America. Stay with it, because by the end, you'll understand exactly what that trademark yellow paint actually cost. The day the wheels came off. Picture California's San Joaquin Delta in the 1890 seconds. Black beet soiled, soft as wet cake batter, stretching for miles. Wheat country, rich, valuable, and almost impossible to farm with anything heavier than a horse. But Benjamin Holt didn't see impossible. He saw a problem, waiting on a machine. Holt had already built one monster, a 60-horsepower steam traction engine nicknamed Old Betsy, 24 feet of iron, weighing 24 tons, fired by wood, coal, or oil. The thing ran. It was also enormous, and enormous machines have one weakness in soft ground: they sink. So Holt tried wider wheels, 7.5 feet tall, 6 feet across, a single tractor, 46 feet wide, wheel to wheel. The machine built to conquer the mud had simply become too big to move through it. There was a second danger riding along with every one of these machines, one that had nothing to do with mud. Steam traction engines of that era ran on high-pressure boilers, and an unwatched boiler could turn into a bomb in seconds. Newspapers across farm country reported blowouts almost every harvest season, scalding crews and hurling drive wheels 100 feet. Holt's machines were bigger than most, which meant more pressure and more to go wrong. The mud wasn't the only thing trying to kill a tractor operator in 1904. The boiler under his seat was just as willing. So Holt tried something else entirely. On Thanksgiving Day, 1904, out on Roberts Island, he stripped the wheels off one of his steamers and bolted on a set of wooden tracks running over chains. The machine that crawled across that soggy delta field that afternoon didn't sink an inch. His own company photographer, watching the tracks rise and fall over the carrier rollers through his camera lens, said it looked like a caterpillar crossing the field. The name stuck. Holt trademarked it in 1910. It would outlive him, outlive the company that first carried it, and end up stamped on machines tearing into ground on 6 continents. But Holt wasn't the only man chasing this problem. Up the valley, a rival named C.L. Best was building his own gasoline track layers, and the 2 men despised each other. Over more than a decade, Holt and Best burned through roughly $1.5 million in legal fees, fighting over patents, trying to bury each other in court instead of mud. Holt held 47 patents, Best held 27. Between the 2 camps, there were enough lawyers on retainer to staff a small firm. Here's the twist: nobody on either side saw coming. The First World War didn't make either company rich enough to win the fight outright. It just changed what winning even meant. Holt's tractors went to war hauling artillery for armies that had run completely out of horses. 10,000 of them crossed the Atlantic. A British general named Ernest Swinton watched those tracks crawl through the mud around Stockton and walked away believing he'd just seen the answer to trench warfare. Historians still argue over exactly how directly Holt's tracks fed into the tank's design, but Swinton himself credited the inspiration, and by 1918 he was personally thanking Holt and his workforce for what their machines had helped make possible. Meanwhile, back home, neither company had stopped trying to bury the other. For the better part of 2 decades, Holt and Best ran competing dealer networks and competing advertising campaigns, each one telling farmers and contractors that the other man's track layer was the inferior machine. The rivalry wasn't a footnote to the founding story. It was the founding story. Victory should have been the payoff. Instead, the war left both companies drowning in surplus tractors nobody wanted to buy anymore. Best had spent those years quietly innovating, while Holt was buried under military contracts. By 1925, both companies were circling bankruptcy at the same time. A bondbroker named Harry Fair looked at both balance sheets and came to a brutal conclusion. Neither one would survive alone. So, the bitterest rivals in American tractor manufacturing did the only thing that made financial sense anymore. They merged. Caterpillar Tractor Company was born in April and May of 1925, not out of triumph, but out of two companies too broke to keep hating each other. C.L. Best took over as CEO. The factory floor in East Peoria, Illinois, purchased 16 years earlier out of a bankrupt farm implement maker for a fraction of what the building and machinery were actually worth, became the new company's beating heart. They had the name now. They had the tracks. They had the factory. What they didn't have yet was proof that any of it could survive the next disaster already bearing down on them. Because the same depression that was about to bankrupt half of American industry was about to become Caterpillar's biggest gamble. And the bet they placed on a single engine would either build an empire or bury one. Steel bones, diesel heart. In the worst years of the Great Depression, while competitors mothballed their factories and gutted their payrolls, a small team inside Caterpillar made a decision that looked, frankly, insane. They bet the company on diesel. Gasoline engines were the standard. Reliable, cheap to build, well understood. Diesel was unproven for this kind of heavy hauling work, finicky and expensive, and nobody had made it run reliably inside a tractor. But diesel had one advantage that mattered more than any of that. It produced enormous torque while burning roughly half the fuel of a gas engine. For a farmer or a contractor running a machine 10 hours a day, that gap was the difference between profit and ruin. In June of 1930, in a shop in San Leandro, California, engineer C.G.A. Rosen and his team finished assembling a hand-built prototype, engine model D9900. They nicknamed it Old Betsy II, an echo of Holt's old steam tractor, because this engine was about to do to gasoline exactly what Holt's tracks had done to wheels. For 16 straight months, they ran that engine through test after test, in the depths of the Depression, while half the tractor industry in America was dying around them. Then in October 1931, the Diesel 60 rolled off the line, Caterpillar's first diesel-powered tractor. Within a few years, the company wasn't just making diesel tractors anymore. It was the largest diesel engine manufacturer on Earth. That single bet, placed when the smart money said retreat, is the reason every Cat machine built since has run on a diesel heart instead of a gasoline one. 42 years later, Caterpillar engineers pulled that same D9900 prototype out of storage and ran it through a modern emissions test cell, mostly out of curiosity. It passed. An engine built in the worst year of the Great Depression met regulations written 4 decades into the future, which says less about nostalgia and more about how good that original bet on diesel really was. That same year, 1931, the company made one more change that had nothing to do with horsepower. Its machines had always rolled off the line in plain battleship gray. Citing the need for better visibility on crowded construction sites, Caterpillar repainted its entire lineup into the color now known as highway yellow. The color people associate with raw industrial power today started life as a safety measure. But an engine is only half of any machine. The other half is what's standing on top of it. Strip away the paint and the badge, and a bulldozer is one of the simplest brutal machines ever built. Diesel ignites, drives the pistons. The pistons spin a crankshaft. The crankshaft feeds a torque converter that multiplies raw power into something that can shove a boulder the size of a house. That power runs down through a transmission into final drives that turn massive sprockets. And the sprockets pull a chain of steel track plates underneath the machine, laying its own road down ahead of itself and picking it back up behind. Could the steel actually survive that kind of punishment at scale? That was never a given. Take the modern D9, Caterpillar's mid-heavy workhorse, weighing in around 49 tons and putting out close to 475 horsepower. Now go bigger. The D11, introduced in the mid-1980 seconds and still in production today, weighs 248,500 pounds, roughly the same as 10 loaded school buses, riding on 2 steel tracks with an 850 horsepower engine behind it and a blade wide enough to swallow 45 cubic yards of broken rock in a single push. These machines are so enormous that shipping one anywhere requires partial disassembly. The blade comes off, the ripper frame comes off, and the pieces travel separately by rail or flatbed truck before being rebuilt on site. Every gear, every final drive, every roller on a machine this size is absorbing forces that would shred an ordinary vehicle's drivetrain in hours. Engineers solved the worst of it by elevating the drive sprocket, lifting the most vulnerable components up out of the mud, rock, and abrasive grit that destroys lesser machines from the bottom up. The fix held. It also meant that when something did fail at this scale, it never failed quietly, and there was always somewhere harder to send these machines next. Caterpillar's own company history records that in 1936, its track-type tractors helped build Hoover Dam, hauling rock and grading roads where the Bureau of Reclamation was racing a government deadline to tame the Colorado River. Workers on that site faced heat above 120 degrees, tunnels choking with truck exhaust and carbon monoxide, and rock falls from canyon walls hundreds of feet above their heads. The dam's official death toll stands at 96 men. Crushed by falling rock, run over by trucks and heavy equipment, drowned or killed in blasting accidents. Some families always believed the real number was higher, because deaths the company logged as pneumonia looked, to them, an awful lot like carbon monoxide poisoning nobody wanted on the books. That's the trade Caterpillar's machines kept making, decade after decade. Move an impossible amount of earth on an impossible deadline with the best technology anyone had, and somebody pays the difference between impossible and done. Hoover Dam wasn't even the hardest job machines wearing this badge would ever take on. Half a century earlier, before Caterpillar existed as a company, the men who would eventually build it were already cutting through a mountain range in Panama. In 1904, a steam shovel maker called the Bucyrus Foundry and Manufacturing Company won the largest equipment contract on the entire project, supplying 77 of the 102 steam shovels used to dig the Panama Canal. These were 95-ton machines, each crewed like a small locomotive, an engineer, 2 firemen feeding the boiler, and a cranoman, with 6 more men on the ground laying the rails the shovel crawled along. In March 1910, a single one of those shovels set a construction record at the brutal Culebra Cut, tearing 70,000 cubic yards out of the mountain in 26 days. President Theodore Roosevelt was photographed at the controls of one in 1906, grinning in a white suit and a Panama hat, like a man with no idea what the job actually cost. It cost plenty. Roughly 56,000 workers labored on the American phase of the canal between 1904 and 1913. Landslides, drowning, blasting accidents, and tropical disease killed more than 5,600 of them, on top of the tens of thousands the French had already lost trying and failing to finish that same canal a generation earlier. Bucyrus went on to build some of the largest earth-moving machines in history. Caterpillar bought the company outright in 2011 for $7.6 billion. From that day forward, Caterpillar could honestly claim something almost no other company on Earth could. Machines wearing its badge in one lineage or another had dug the Panama Canal not once, but twice. Across the decade-long expansion project that followed, more than 400 pieces of modern Cat earth-moving equipment moved over 100 million cubic meters of rock and soil to build a third lane of locks wide enough for ships the original engineers couldn't have dreamed of. World War II turned that same diesel know-how into something the company had never been before, an arms manufacturer in its own right. It built the diesel engines that powered Sherman M4 tanks rolling across North Africa and Europe, putting its own engineering directly into the machines fighting the war, not just the machines clearing a path ahead of it. For a while, the Soviets tried to compete on the same ground. By the early 1980s, Caterpillar controlled roughly 85% of the Soviet market for tractors and bulldozers, against just 15% for a young Japanese rival named Komatsu. Then, Cold War politics intervened. Export sanctions choked off Caterpillar's access to that market almost overnight, and within a couple of years, Komatsu had flipped that ratio entirely in its own favor. It looked, at the time, like a minor business setback. It would turn out to be the opening shot in a war that nearly tore the company apart from the inside. The engineering held. The diesel held. What didn't hold, eventually, were the men standing next to the machines while they ran, and the company that was supposed to be looking out for them. The men who fed the iron. Here's something the brochures never put on the cover. Building a Caterpillar machine is, in its own way, as dangerous as operating one. Inside a foundry like the one in Mapleton, Illinois, just outside Peoria, one of the largest cast iron foundries of its kind in the country, workers don't assemble machines so much as give birth to them. Furnaces melt scrap and pig iron at temperatures above 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That molten metal gets transferred, ladle by ladle, often suspended from overhead gantry cranes, into molds that will eventually become engine blocks, transmission housings, and the guts of every dozer rolling off the line. How do you move liquid metal hot enough to vaporize a hand on contact? Very, very carefully. Carefully is exactly the part that's easy to get wrong when you're undertrained and standing 4 feet from an open container of it. One Caterpillar worker describing conditions inside the Mapleton plant said new hires with only a few months of experience were routinely put straight onto some of the most dangerous jobs in the entire building. Management denied it. Workers said you could see it happening on any given shift. So what happens when that gap between training and danger finally closes? You get Scott Adams. 50 years old, a 27-year veteran electrician who'd completed the full 5-year apprenticeship with the Electrical Workers Union. In December 2021, working as a contractor at the Mapleton foundry, he stepped off a ladder and fell more than 20 feet through a hole in the floor. He died from the fall. 6 months later, it happened again, to a man who hadn't even finished his second week on the job. Stephen Dierkes was 39 years old. 9 days into his employment, he fell into an 11-foot-deep crucible of molten iron heated past 2,000 degrees. Federal investigators described what happened to him in 2 blunt words: immediately incinerated. The follow-up investigation found that the foundry had routinely let employees work within 4 feet of open containers of molten iron, with no guardrail and no travel restraint. Nothing standing between a misstep and instant death. The fine for that finding came to $145,027. Caterpillar contested it in court. 2 years later, at the same foundry, Dalton Simmers, 28 years old, was transferring molten metal from a furnace into a smaller pot when the metal spilled. The coroner's report said he likely died within seconds, consumed by fire and liquid iron before anyone could reach him. 3 men, 3 years, 1 foundry. Remember the question this whole story opened with. How does the company that built the machines that built modern America end up known for burying its own men? You're looking at the answer right now. It isn't one disaster. It's 3 of them, spaced out just far enough apart that each one reads, on its own, like an isolated tragedy. The foundry wasn't the only place where Caterpillar's machines turned dangerous either. When the company absorbed Bushrice in 2011, it didn't just buy a manufacturer. It bought a catalog of the largest machines human beings have ever built for tearing the earth open. Take Big Muskie, built in 1969 for the Central Ohio Coal Company. This Bushrice Airy walking dragline weighed 27 million pounds, stood nearly 22 stories tall, and swung a bucket so large it could hold 2 entire Greyhound buses side by side. Over 22 years of strip mining operations in Ohio, it tore more than 600 million cubic yards of rock and soil off the top of the earth to expose the coal seams underneath, run by a crew of just 5 men, drawing enough electricity to power 27,000 homes. When it was finally scrapped in 1999, it took so much steel to bring down that the scrap alone sold for $700,000. Machines on that scale don't fail small. They fail in ways that can swallow a man whole, and nobody even notices for hours. On December 26, 2002, at a surface coal mine in West Virginia, a dragline oiler named Dan Gray finished his shift and asked the operator to let him off the machine. The operator swung the bull around, set the brakes, and watched Gray climb down onto the dragline shoe. Production continued. An hour later, Gray's wife called looking for him. The crew checked, saw his truck still parked at the mine, and assumed he was just running late, the way he sometimes did. Nobody thought anything of it. It wasn't until the operator paused the machine to let the dust clear at the end of a routine cycle, hours later, that he looked down and saw a body lying near the digging face. Federal investigators determined Gray had been struck by the machine itself, on the same uneven, half-frozen ground his co-workers had been working over for the rest of the shift, without anyone realizing what had happened beneath them. Tearing open a mine isn't only about what disappears underground. Sometimes it's the men. Caterpillar's largest dragline today, the 8,750, still swings a bucket capacity of 169 cubic yards on a 435-foot boom, weighing 8,350 tons. By any honest measure, it's still a big muskie waiting for the right mine. But the danger inside Caterpillar's world was never confined to the foundry floor or the strip mine either. Sometimes the company's machines, and the men running them, went straight into combat. When the United States Navy needed airfields carved out of solid jungle in the middle of a world war, it didn't wait for peace. The CB's, Naval Construction Battalions, landed at Guadalcanal in 1942, riding Caterpillar-built tractors with rifles slung over their shoulders, because the gap between a finished airstrip and a dead pilot was measured in days, not months. The military had its own dry name for these machines: tractor, heavy, M1, but every man on the ground just called it a cat. At Espiritu Santo, a CB detachment carved a 6,000-foot bomber strip out of raw jungle in 20 days flat. On Treasury Island in November 1943, a CB named Aurelio Tassoni drove his bulldozer straight at a Japanese pillbox that had pinned down the entire landing party. Using the steel blade itself as a shield while an officer gave him covering fire, he crushed the position, killing everyone inside, and walked away with the Silver Star. Not every operator was that lucky. On Iwo Jima, men drove bulldozers up roads still under direct observation from Japanese gun positions on Mount Suribachi. One account from the battle is almost clinical in describing the horror, recalling that 2 drivers were killed at the controls of an unarmored dozer that had been ordered up to cut down an exposed bank, simply because the work had to continue no matter who was sitting in the seat. Another operator, a machinist's mate named Clinton Trefizon, hit a buried mine while grading a road on the same island. The blast lifted his entire dozer off the ground, blew his helmet clean off, and knocked a track loose, while he sat there dazed, alone in the seat of a machine that had just tried to kill him. By the time the war ended, more than 500 CBs had died in construction accidents alone, separate from roughly 290 men killed outright in combat. Building the runways and roads that won the Pacific War cost nearly as many lives as the fighting that followed behind them. Vietnam would prove that kind of sacrifice wasn't a wartime exception. It was about to become standard operating procedure. The cost of doing business. By 1966, the United States Army had a problem that no amount of firepower could solve. It couldn't see the enemy. Triple canopy jungle hid base camps, supply routes, and ambush positions across South Vietnam, and conventional infantry sweeps only ever displaced the Viet Cong temporarily. The moment American soldiers left an area, the jungle closed back in behind them, and the enemy came home. The Army's answer was a machine the troops nicknamed the Hog Jaw. Built on a Caterpillar D7E chassis, and later the larger D9, the Rome Plow carried a 2.5-ton steel blade angled 30 degrees with a reinforced steel stinger jutting from one side, strong enough to stab and twist down a tree too big to fell in a single pass. A protective cage and an overhead headache bars shielded the operator from falling branches. Fully kitted with blade, cage, and armor plating, the machine weighed well past 20 tons of steel pushing into the underbrush. Its job is to erase the jungle, acre by acre, and erase the enemy's cover along with it. The first land-clearing teams arrived in 1967, and within a few years, entire stretches of the Iron Triangle and the Hobo Woods had gone from impenetrable jungle to opal pasture. But here's what the operators learned almost immediately. The machine built to protect them from ambush couldn't protect them from the ground itself. One mechanic with the 86th Engineer Battalion remembered losing a lot of operators to rollovers on the broken terrain. Others were badly burned by acid leaking from cracked batteries during the rough going. And underneath nearly every acre they were ordered to clear sat something the operators couldn't see until it was already too late. Specialist 4 William Clapper was leading point for the 62nd Land Clearing Engineer Battalion, cutting a perimeter for a night defensive position deep in the jungle when his Rome Plow rolled directly over a buried mine. The blast lifted the entire machine into the air and slammed Clapper down into the floor mat beneath his own boots. In that instant, he had a decision to make: bail out into open ground and risk enemy fire from the tree line, or stay inside the armored cage and risk being a sitting target if this was the opening move of an ambush. He stayed. The cage held. Between 1970 and 1971 alone, the 62nd Engineer Battalion earned 174 Purple Hearts. They lost 25 operators. For a construction unit, not infantry, not armor, a unit whose entire job was clearing land rather than taking it, that casualty rate was almost unheard of. The jungle never cared what your unit patch said. So the question the whole war kept circling back to was simple. How many men would it cost to clear enough jungle that the enemy had nowhere left to hide? Nobody in Washington ever put a number on that. The operators in the field already suspected the answer was going to be higher than anyone wanted to say out loud. Combat is one kind of war zone, with an enemy actively trying to kill the man in the seat. What's harder to explain is what happened back home, inside Caterpillar's own factories, once the guns finally went quiet. By 1980, Caterpillar was hemorrhaging money. Komatsu, the same rival that had taken over the Soviet market a few years earlier, was now undercutting Caterpillar globally on price. The company was losing roughly $1 million a day. 8,000 workers went on indefinite layoff, then more. At the worst point of the crisis, 18,500 employees, nearly a quarter of the entire workforce, were sitting at home with no paycheck. Most of them in central Illinois, in a city where Caterpillar was at its peak, more than a fifth of the entire local economy. A 7.5-month strike followed in 1982 and 1983. The longest company-wide walkout in the history of the United Auto Workers Union up to that point. The union lost. A concession contract followed in 1986 that gutted 418 separate job classifications at the Peoria plant down to just 50, stripping away decades of negotiated protections with a single signature. And that was just the warm-up. In November 1991, after Caterpillar refused to match a pattern contract the union had already settled with rival John Deere, thousands of UAW members walked out. 5.5 months later, the union surrendered. Not because they ran out of resolve, but because Caterpillar threatened something almost no major American manufacturer had dared attempt at that scale before: permanently replacing every striking worker with someone new. It worked once, so management tried it again. When the union struck a second time in June 1994, demanding reinstatement of workers fired for wearing pro-union shirts and singing on the assembly line, more than 13,000 workers walked out across 8 plants in Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Colorado. Caterpillar held out for 17 straight months, the longest strike in the company's history and one of the longest American manufacturing disputes of the entire decade. Strikers lost their homes, their cars, in some cases, their marriages. Caterpillar kept production running anyway, leaning on salaried staff, management volunteers, and thousands of union members who crossed their own picket lines just to feed their families. The bitterness didn't stay confined to picket signs. Shots were fired into the windows of Caterpillar executives' homes. Neighbors who had known each other for decades stopped speaking, divided by who had crossed the line and who hadn't. Some strikers, worn down by years of stress and lost income, never made it to retirement at all. Over the course of the fight, the union filed 441 separate unfair labor practice complaints with federal regulators. Caterpillar kept posting record quarterly profits the entire time. Local 974 President Jerry Brown had backed nearly every concession Caterpillar asked for through the 1980s, believing it would save jobs in the long run. By 1994, he was willing to admit out loud exactly what that strategy had actually cost. "I bought all that stuff. We did it. We made them global-class competitors." By the time he said it, the concessions Caterpillar had pioneered on its own assembly lines were already being copied by other manufacturers across the country, each one pointing to Peoria as proof that even the most militant union local in America could be outlasted. That's the brutal arithmetic underneath this whole chapter. Every time Caterpillar's machines proved they could outwork, outweigh, and outlast anything standing in their path, it was the people standing closest to those machines, in the jungle, on the picket line, or 4 feet from an open ladle of molten iron, who absorbed the cost. The company always survived. The survival was never free. Somebody else paid for it, every single time. The men who paid that price assumed, reasonably, that the company they'd given decades to would at least stay where it was built. They were wrong about that, too. The company that drove away. In January 2009, with the global financial crisis tearing through every order book the company had, Caterpillar announced it would shed roughly 20,000 jobs, nearly 1/5 of its entire global workforce. Some of those cuts were already done before the announcement even became official. 2,500 management employees had already taken buyouts. 8,000 contract workers were already gone. The last time Peoria had seen anything like it was that same brutal stretch back in the early 1980s. A lot of residents in the city had genuinely believed, after 30 years of recovery, that kind of pain belonged to the past. It didn't. 8 years later, in 2017, Caterpillar's chief executive at the time, Doug Oberhillman, stood in front of cheering business and civic leaders, including the sitting governor of Illinois, and made a promise that should have been unambiguous. "Caterpillar will stay in Peoria," he said. "I repeat, we will stay in Peoria." Less than 2 years after that promise, the company issued a press release announcing it would relocate a limited group of senior executives and support functions to the Chicago area. The new chief executive, Jim Hoopleby, insisted the company still valued its deep roots in central Illinois and that Peoria would remain the corporate hometown. Anyone parsing the actual language carefully understood what had really just happened. The global headquarters had quietly left town, dressed up in language soft enough that nobody could quote it back as a broken promise, even though that's exactly what it was. The following year, 2018, Caterpillar closed its facility near Aurora, Illinois entirely, laying off 800 workers and shifting wheel loader and compactor production to plants in Decatur, Illinois and North Little Rock, Arkansas. The math behind every one of these decisions made perfect sense on a spreadsheet. It made considerably less sense to the families who built 3 and 4 generations of careers around the company's yellow paint. By then, Caterpillar employed more than 107,000 people worldwide and was pulling in tens of billions of dollars in annual revenue, one of the largest manufacturing companies left in America. It simply no longer needed to be the largest manufacturing company in Peoria. Then came June 2022. Caterpillar announced it was moving its global headquarters again, this time completely out of Illinois, to Irving, Texas, ending a corporate relationship with the state that had lasted more than a century, dating back to the original Holt factory purchase in East Peoria in 1909. The company's official explanation was that the move served its best strategic interest. It did not elaborate further. One Illinois economist called the statement gobbledygook and corporate speak, a description that landed for a lot of people in central Illinois as the kindest possible way of saying the company simply didn't think it owed the region an honest answer anymore. So here's the reframe, and it's the one this whole story has been building toward. Look at any Caterpillar machine sitting on a job site today. A D9 clearing brush, a D11 stripping overburden off a coal seam, an excavator gutting the foundation for the next dam or highway interchange. It still carries the badge of a company built on American soil, and that's not false advertising. The D11 still comes off an assembly line in East Peoria, Illinois, in the same metro area where Benjamin Holt's bankrupt factory purchase first put down roots in 1909. What did Caterpillar actually leave behind? More than you'd think. Track-type tractors graded the approach roads at Hoover Dam. Diesel engines drove the tanks that helped win a world war. Its bulldozers, riding with Marines under fire, carved the airstrips that turned a string of Pacific islands into a path to Japan's doorstep. Its Rome Plows, for all the lives they cost, opened ground the Army couldn't have held otherwise. Mining shovels and drag lines under the Caterpillar badge, absorbed from Bucyrus in 2011, still tear into the coal and copper seams that keep much of the world's lights on. There is no corner of modern American infrastructure that doesn't owe something to a machine built inside that factory. There's a second kind of road crushing this story owes you, one that never makes the company history page. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 launched the largest public works program America had attempted. 41,000 miles of new interstate, built with the same class of earth-moving equipment Caterpillar had spent 3 decades perfecting. By the federal government's own estimate, that campaign displaced more than 475,000 households and over 1 million people nationwide. Whole neighborhoods in Detroit, Miami, and New Orleans were leveled for elevated expressways cutting straight through them. In New Orleans, locals nicknamed the overpass that replaced their oak-lined avenue and its black-owned businesses simply the monster. A bulldozer blade doesn't choose where the road goes. Somebody upstream decides that. The machine just runs the path it's pointed at. But the company that builds it doesn't call that place home anymore. Hasn't, officially, since 2022. The machines stayed loyal to the soil that made them. The corporation didn't. And there is no corner of that legacy without a body count attached. 96 dead at Hoover Dam, more than 5,600 dead digging the Panama Canal, 25 operators lost in a single Army battalion clearing Vietnamese jungle in under 2 years. 3 men killed at one Illinois foundry between 2021 and 2024. The only federal fine among them, for Stephen Dierke's deaths, coming to a little over $145,000, roughly a minute and a half of the company's own annual revenue. Thousands of workers lost homes, marriages, and decades of seniority. Across 2 labor wars the company won simply by outlasting them. The machines never apologized for any of it, because machines don't have to. They just keep running, decade after decade, exactly the way they were built to. It was always the people standing next to them who paid the difference between what got built and what it actually cost. They don't make tractors that sink in the mud anymore. They don't have to. 3 generations of operators, foundry workers, and strikers already paid that debt in full, and the company that owed it to them packed up its headquarters and left the state before the bill ever came due. Drive past almost any construction site in this country, and you'll still see that yellow paint, parked on a hill of dirt it just finished moving. It's easy to admire. It's harder to ask what that hill cost, and who actually paid for it. The factory that built the machines that crushed roads through America never stopped building. It just stopped staying.